To liberate all sentient beings as infinite as space, please give rise to the supreme and precious bodhicitta. Now we will begin studying the Prajnaparamita Heart Sutra. Yesterday I gave a brief introduction. We should try our best to study this sutra because this text, in terms of its literal meaning, is not particularly difficult. In fact, it's quite simple and it isn't hard for everyone to memorize. As monastics and practicing lay people, everyone should be able to recite it from memory. Once memorized, you can chant the Heart Sutra anytime and anywhere. As I mentioned yesterday, on the one hand, during our practice in this very life, if we encounter any adverse conditions or obstacles, we can dispel them by relying on its power. Furthermore, in terms of supramundane merit, it is the very essence and pith of Prajnaparamita emptiness. The merit of contemplating emptiness and reciting sutras on emptiness goes without saying, as you all should be very clear about it. Although it is very simple to do, its significance and merit are actually immense. Therefore, practitioners should highly value it. When teaching the Heart Sutra this time, I might explain the literal meaning a bit more extensively. What is the reason for this? Because since ancient times, the Heart Sutra has been highly regarded in Tibetan Buddhism. Many eminent monks and great masters of all schools and lineages have written specific commentaries and explanations on it. Especially in Han Chinese Buddhism, there are many monastics, lay people, research centers in modern academic institutions, and university professors specializing in Buddhism who are actively researching the Heart Sutra. So I think for us, as those who study or practice the Dharma, regarding the most fundamental perspectives and theories on the Heart Sutra, if we do not thoroughly understand them, it probably wouldn't be very reasonable. We have time on this occasion because when I teach elsewhere, I always feel like there isn't enough time. For example, if I schedule 3 days or 1 day, it seems a bit difficult to teach emptiness every single day. Moreover, the Prajnaparamita Heart Sutra is a profound Dharma teaching on emptiness, which ordinary people simply cannot accept. You should remember that in the words of my perfect teacher, when Venerable Atisha was in India, there were 2 bhikkhus whose conduct and demeanor were exceedingly pure. At first, when taught the selflessness of persons, they were very happy. Later, when the selflessness of phenomena was taught, they became completely terrified. As soon as the Heart Sutra was recited or its content was explained, they covered their ears and ran away. Later, Venerable Atisha also said that merely keeping the Shravakayana precepts pure doesn't have much significance. One must listen and study extensively and thoroughly understand the Prajnaparamita, otherwise the Buddha's perfect wisdom cannot be mastered. This story I'm telling might not be perfectly detailed, but I remember it being roughly like this. So even in India, ordinary people simply could not accept the Heart Sutra. We can also see this today, as many beginners in Buddhism, when taught the Heart Sutra, will think, how can it say there are no eyes, ears, nose, tongue, forms, sounds, smells, or tastes? Look, I have eyes, and I can personally perceive forms, sounds, smells, tastes, and externally existing things. I see this with my own eyes. What is Buddhism actually talking about? Not only do many people fail to benefit, they even generate wrong views. Therefore, why do the tantric teachings of the Great Perfection require a long period of preliminary practices? Only after undergoing extensive training can one enter into them. In addition, just as it is explained in the root stanzas of the Middle Way, the Dharma teachings on Prajnaparamita emptiness also require a period of cultivation. Then, when the person's capacity and disposition have matured slightly in all aspects, only then can the teachings on emptiness be transmitted, otherwise they cannot be taught directly. You might all think, can I receive the Great Perfection? It's a bit difficult right now because I haven't done the preliminary practices. But the Heart Sutra shouldn't be a problem, as it's a very simple teaching. You shouldn't think this way either. If you feel that your mind stream cannot yet generate the realization of emptiness, especially those who have just started learning Buddhism, I think listening to the Heart Sutra might be a bit difficult. You might not necessarily be able to accept it. Therefore, when the Heart Sutra is being taught, you could take a break for a few days, and listening to it after some time might be better. You are able to accept listening to the preliminary practices and other teachings, because in other aspects of the Dharma, such as good begetting good and evil begetting evil, many teachings from the vehicle of gods and humans are acceptable to you. However, the very profound teachings within the Heart Sutra might not be accepted by some Dharma friends who have just started learning Buddhism. Therefore, regarding profound emptiness, you should still examine your own capacity. It is not just the great perfection. The same principle actually applies to prajna paramita emptiness. If you cannot accept it, not only is it meaningless to you, it actually harms you. In light of this, regarding this matter, you should all reflect upon yourselves and see whether your capacity actually meets the conditions and criteria to be a vessel for practicing emptiness. So you should all be clear about this issue, which is why I am mentioning it here today. There might be one more point. Yesterday we discussed the title of the Prajna Paramita Heart Sutra. What is the main focus of this teaching? It is the version translated by Xuanzang during the Tang dynasty. Regarding the translator of this sutra, some history about Tang Xuanzang, you should all be clear about it. Therefore, I won't elaborate extensively here. Logically, one should also understand his background at this point, his identity, and what kind of figure he was in Buddhism. This point should be clear. After Tang Xuanzang returned to China, he originally really wanted to go back to India. For some translated sutras, he wanted to compare them with the Sanskrit texts again. However, Emperor Taizong felt Xuanzang was a national treasure, so he consistently refused to let him go. Because going there at that time wasn't as open as it is now. It wasn't like the current situation. It was all clandestine travel. In modern terms, there were all kinds of dangers on the road. If Tang Xuanzang went again, he might not be able to return. At that time, the king, or rather the emperor, highly respected Tang Xuanzang. So in the Heart Sutra, the phrase by imperial decree is commonly used, meaning the king ordered him to translate it. This is also the case in many of his translated works. Finally, when Tang Xuanzang passed away, in the entire history of China, there had never been such a grand Dharma assembly. When we open the history books, as originally found at the end of Buddhism and Science, in the section on the contributions of monastics to society, I briefly mentioned some content about how the government and society viewed monastics at that time. You should also be clear about this point. Although Tang Xuanzang ultimately didn't make it back to India, the Heart Sutra translated by him is what we have been reciting all along. Reciting and practicing it like this now is, I think, very good and necessary. But at the same time, it is still necessary to understand the other translated versions. For example, the earliest one should be the translation by Kumarajiva, as I also mentioned yesterday. The Heart Sutra had 7 Chinese versions in ancient times. Kumarajiva's translation should be the first version in history. He named the Heart Sutra the Mahaprajnaparamita Great Vidyadharani Sutra. The second version was translated by Tang Xuanzang, which is the Prajnaparamita Heart Sutra. There was also a version by Bodhiruchi from the Tang dynasty, but this version seems to be lost now. It is said that it's not in the Tripitaka. I haven't checked, but I heard it's missing. There is another one also from the Tang dynasty by Dharmakandra. He translated the Universal Wisdom Store Prajna Paramita Heart Sutra. Then there was Prajna and Lian, along with a few others, who translated it together. I recently requested that the version by Prajna and Lian, along with Xuanzang's and Kumarajiva's versions, be printed together. They might be finished printing tomorrow. I think it's best for the managers of each district to be responsible for distributing them tomorrow. It might not be very convenient for the study committee members this time, so the managers of each district should ideally discuss this among themselves before tomorrow's class. Senior and junior managers can see how to handle it. One is Xuanzang's translation, and another is the translation by Prajna and Lian. Their translation is from ancient times. I have looked at some ancient translations, and the one closest to the Tibetan text is the one translated by Prajna and Lian. Nowadays there are also some people who have translated the Heart Sutra, but some are purely academic, and their content does not directly use Buddhist terminology for translation. So I am not very satisfied with them. Therefore, among the translations, the earlier translation by Prajna and Lian is relatively closer. There is also one by Prajna Kakra, also from the Tang dynasty, and there is a translation by Fa Cheng, also titled the Prajna Paramita Heart Sutra. These are all from the Tang dynasty. There are roughly that many versions. Later in the Song dynasty, Master Dhanapala translated the Prajna Paramita, Mother of Buddha's Heart Sutra. So there are roughly this many translated versions in Chinese. Now the key lies in this issue. There isn't much debate on other aspects. The main point is, as I mentioned yesterday, the prologue at the beginning and the dissemination section at the end, or what we call the concluding section, are only absent in the Heart Sutras of Xuanzang and Kumarajiva. All the other existing versions of the Heart Sutra have them. Regarding this specific issue, whether in society or academia, there is significant debate. Some say Xuanzang's translation is incomplete and view it negatively. There are such refutations of his translation, which is generally called the abridged version. Since it lacks the opening and closing sections, some claim an abridged Heart Sutra is illogical. That is one perspective. Others have issues with the extended versions. As I mentioned earlier, 5 versions have both prologues and epilogues, but some argue these extended versions are illogical. There was a scholar who wasn't very well known initially, but he presented various arguments stating that only Xuanzang's translation is valid, while the other extended versions are not. This has been noted in several books. As a university professor, he used extensive evidence to argue that Xuanzang's abridged version is the legitimate one. What was his reasoning? First, in the Japanese Tripitaka, this same abridged version exists. He saw this as a valid justification. Second, among the ancient Tang dynasty texts discovered in the Dunhuang caves, there are copies identical to the abridged version. Based on these 2 points, he inferred that the other extended versions were invalid. Regarding the extended versions, he claimed the prologues and epilogues were taken from the extended Prajnaparamita or other sutras and simply attached to the Heart Sutra. That was his assertion, but this thesis is certainly unsustainable. Why is it unsustainable? His reasoning was based on what he hadn't seen, or simply because he didn't find them in Dunhuang or the Japanese Tripitaka. But their absence in the Japanese Tripitaka doesn't necessarily mean they are apocryphal. At that time he wrote in some books that the extended version was a later forgery, using very harsh language. However, this view is also unreasonable. When we discuss the Heart Sutra later, we will see that within the entire Tripitaka, it exists as a complete independent work, not just a single chapter from the Prajnaparamita. Later, he might have encountered complete Sanskrit extended versions, but he then claimed Indians had added to them later. This is also completely without basis. If we claim the Tripitaka was altered by later Indians, such a premise is surely unreliable. There was another scholar who likely studied Buddhist logic. He was more in favor of the extended version and its structural reasoning, and expressed some dissatisfaction with Xuanzang's translation. Around 2001, a Hong Kong Buddhist magazine published an article claiming Xuanzang's translation was flawed. The reasons cited were, first, the Tibetan version includes the prologue and epilogue. Second, some Sanskrit titles include Arya, noble, as in Arya Prajnaparamita Hridaya, whereas in Xuanzang's Heart Sutra, the word Arya is omitted. Furthermore, the phrase relieving all suffering cannot be found in the Sanskrit original, nor in the Tibetan version, and so on. Using these points to reject Xuanzang's translation, he refused to recognize the abridged version. But I believe that just because something is missing in one version doesn't mean it is absent in all others. There's no need to rely on a single version for comparison. As you all know, Indian Buddhism faced 3 major periods of destruction, and different versions existed. It doesn't have to be just one specific way. The Buddha's teachings can manifest in various forms to different beings. Currently, the southern Tripitaka and the northern Tripitaka differ in many aspects. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism, some precepts of the 18 early Buddhist schools differ significantly from those in Theravada Buddhism. But to label them as forgeries, simply because of these differences, is completely groundless. What view should we hold for ourselves? Of course, for us humble individuals to establish our own definitive view might seem quite presumptuous. However, I should remind you that when encountering people with these views, it's very easy to just agree and say, oh yes, you're right, only the extended version is valid, the abridged one is wrong. Some might even say we should stop reciting Xuanzang's version. It's very possible people will say such things, but if we meet another group, we might say, yes, only the abridged version is correct, and the extended ones are all invalid. This could lead us to slander the Dharma. Buddha's words can manifest in diverse ways, and the source texts used by great translators were not necessarily identical. There is no need to abandon a teaching simply because it is different. That is truly unnecessary. So when we practice our recitations, for instance, with Xuanzang's Heart Sutra, indeed, if you compare it word for word with the Tibetan, some parts simply won't align. You will see for yourselves that some parts have more and some have less, but to discard it or call it a forgery based on that is, in my view, completely unnecessary. Throughout our spiritual journey, it is crucial to maintain this balanced view. Regarding these issues with the Heart Sutra, I'm not sure if you have ever encountered such discussions with other Buddhists or scholars. You almost certainly will in the future. When that happens, having your own grounded perspective is very important. Differences will always exist. First, you must recognize where the differences lie. This we must know. Then, once you understand the difference, will you refute or support it? What stance will you personally take? As I just mentioned, in my personal view, I praise both the Abridged Heart Sutra and the Extended Heart Sutra. There is absolutely no contradiction between them, and no need to choose one over the other. The Buddhist world today can be quite complex. You might be aware of a similar issue concerning the Infinite Life Sutra. In the past, the layman Xiaolianzhu compiled 5 previous versions into one. Later, Elder Layman Huangnyanzhu promoted it vigorously. In many of his earlier commentaries, he praised it highly, calling it an unprecedented sublime teaching. Since Elder Layman Huangnyanzhu practiced Chan, Tantra, and Pure Land Buddhism, especially Pure Land, he established and supported Xiaolianzhu's view. Xiaolianzhu compiled 5 different versions into a single Infinite Life Sutra. As you may know, to this day, this controversy has not settled. In fact, the biggest war or debate in Pure Land Buddhism centers precisely on this issue. One group argues that layman Xiaolianzhu should not have taken fragments from various sources and compiled them into one new sutra. They say it's inappropriate. Others believe it is acceptable. In particular, Elder Layman Huangnyanzhu believed it was permissible. When we were at the Minnan Buddhist Academy, some people raised this question. My own thoughts are as follows. Since this is a long-standing debate, previously, Layman Wang Longshu also created a compiled edition. Master Yingguang later refuted it, saying there was no justification to compile sutras by taking things out of context. He spoke extensively on this. This is why the issue is taken very seriously in Pure Land circles. But in reality, the Infinite Life Sutra also exists in Tibetan. In Chinese, since ancient times, there hasn't been one single definitive version. From the Song dynasty until now, many great laymen have made compilations. At the time, Elder Layman Huangnyanzhu said compilation was not necessarily wrong. Others insisted it was strictly forbidden, because these are the Buddha's spoken words. And Layman Xiaolianzhu was, after all, a layperson, and a layperson has no authority to compile sutras. Huangnyanzhu replied that while Sha was a layman, he was assisted by Dharma Master Huming, who was a recognized great master. He should have had the capacity. That was his answer to the critics. Whether such reasons are sufficient is hard to say at present. The manifestations of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and great masters are truly inconceivable. For people like us to pass judgment, we have neither the reason nor the qualification. Furthermore, there is a high possibility that by following our own discursive thoughts, we might create very serious negative karma. Generally speaking, however, this issue is certainly worth analyzing. I have long intended to translate the Infinite Life Sutra. I recall that back in 1993, His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche gave us the oral transmission for it. If we were to translate it, perhaps some of the ongoing debates would naturally subside. Then again, some might still not accept it, claiming Tibetan scriptures are also apocryphal, this or that doesn't align, because some points in this sutra might not necessarily match current understandings. Comparing how this matches that can become quite a complicated matter. For instance, the Pure Land school has been divided over this. Even up to the present day, some slander the elder lay practitioner Huangnyanzhu, while others slander Master Yingguang. Regardless, the controversy continues without end. Regarding the views on the compiled editions, I should clarify that I am here representing neither the Academy nor anyone else. My personal perspective is this: if you truly want to compile them, placing the sutras together one by one and combining them all, there may indeed be variations found in the Indian versions, as they were translated by many different masters back then. In particular, Kangsen Gui was very famous during the Three Kingdoms period. Although their translations are older, what would happen if we didn't make use of them? So regarding these issues, you need to consider them for yourselves. Otherwise, when we go out and someone asks, we might fail to answer. Another person might ask, what is your opinion on the compiled editions? What is your Academy's stance on these compiled texts? Our Academy's view on compiled editions is very positive. Will it rain today? I think our life has been very good lately, benefiting beings and generating bodhicitta in every way. To answer in such a deflected manner is probably not very appropriate. Therefore, first we must understand what the key points of focus are in society today. We should be clear about these and then reflect on them ourselves. We are not biased toward any particular school. We should rely on the scriptural authority and reasoning of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, along with the theories of the lineage masters, and use our own wisdom to analyze. Only then should we establish a position or offer suggestions to others. Without highly reliable evidence, it is best not to be definitive. Making a final determination is very difficult. Today I might feel that something is definitely correct, but tomorrow I may feel that my discursive thoughts are untrustworthy. As His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche used to say, until we reach the stages of a bodhisattva, the discursive thoughts of us ordinary beings are unreliable. They often deceive us. For example, when I was a child, I thought a certain toy was truly wonderful, that nothing better existed in the world. Sometimes we look at children today playing with remote-controlled cars. If we had encountered such toys in our childhood, we would have felt that there was nothing greater in existence. But as we grow older, looking at a remote-controlled car, it doesn't seem like much at all. By the same token, we may now feel that a certain view is very reliable and that no scriptural authority or logic could ever refute our point. Yet when we reach a certain point, it might not necessarily be so. That is why His Holiness often emphasized that establishing a truly correct view is extremely difficult for ordinary beings, unlike the noble ones. Everyone must be very careful about this, especially when speaking. Try your best not to slander others. If you lack a truly reliable basis, you could accept this or that. However, in this process it is still very necessary to establish one's own school of thought. Perhaps I am being a bit wordy today, but on these matters, actual practice is of course very important, but so is a bit of theoretical analysis. As people researching Dharma at a Buddhist academy, if we ignore these aspects entirely, I fear we may harbor many doubts later while benefiting beings and in our own practice. For example, regarding why there are so many versions of the Heart Sutra, it is easy for many people to generate discursive thoughts. Therefore, we must engage in long-term listening and contemplation. There was once a Dharma master who shared his experience. He said that during his first 5 or 6 years ordained, he was essentially half believing and half doubting the sutras. He would read some sutras but not others. He accepted the treatises of some great masters but not others, but rejected others. He always held a sense of skepticism toward the Dharma. It was only after more than a decade that he came to accept all Dharma and all sutras. Recognizing them as authentic sutras, he fully accepted them, believing that what was said was entirely correct. I suspect some of our friends here might be in a similar situation. Thus we must persist in long-term listening and contemplation. In this process, it's not that you suddenly become enlightened today, understanding everything in an instant. It doesn't necessarily work that way. Rather, the ignorance and afflictions in one's mind stream are gradually eliminated, while the wisdom in one's mind stream gradually grows. When people first arrive, seeing 2 different versions of the Heart Sutra, they ask which is real and which is fake. If there are 2 different ones, that can't be right. Why would the Buddha say 2 different things? They have so many doubts like this. The same goes for some of the practitioners in our academy. When they first arrived, they were full of doubts about everything. With all sorts of wrong views, it seemed almost impossible to guide them. But after staying here for over a decade, they are no longer the same people. Initially, they were plagued by skepticism and heavy wrong views. But after some time, even if they still cannot fly through the air, there has been a massive transformation in their inner perspective and understanding. This is the result of listening and contemplation. Buddhist education is an education of wisdom, not merely one of dogma. There are some truths that we might not understand at first. We might feel skeptical or even be unwilling to accept them. When you find it hard to accept something, take advantage of your free time here to debate with the masters and your peers. Discuss it face to face, asking, does this seem illogical? Why is it this way? Through this mutual questioning, those small doubts in your mind stream can be instantly cleared by the wisdom of others. Therefore, in our study of the Dharma, it is absolutely essential to apply diligent study and practice to dispel the darkness of ignorance within us. This is vital. Now let's begin the formal teaching. If you didn't get the translated text today, it would be best to take notes. In Master Xuanzang's version, the opening section is omitted. However, following the Tibetan version and other historical prefaces, we will also cover the introductory portion in our explanation. I have emphasized this repeatedly. When you are chanting on your own, you may use Xuanzang's translation, but for the sake of understanding, we recognize this as a complete sutra, so we must acknowledge the prologue. It begins, "The heart of the perfection of wisdom sutra. Thus have I heard." At one time, the Bhagavan, the Buddha is called the Bhagavan, was staying at Vulture Peak Mountain in Rajgir, in the city of Rajgir, together with a great assembly of monks and bodhisattva mahasattvas. The original scripture is written this way. That concludes this section for today. Let me explain this further. First, regarding "thus have I heard," this generally refers to the 5 or 7 perfections. Think of it like taking minutes at a meeting. When was the time? Where was the location? Who was the chairperson? Who was the recorder? Who were the participants? And what was the agenda? There are usually 7 or 8 key elements. In any formal record, you need the 5 factors like people and location. The secular world is the same. Essentially, in the sutras taught by the Buddha, most begin with "thus have I heard" and end with everyone being filled with great joy, praising and rejoicing in the teachings. These signify the sutras authorized by the Buddha. As we discussed recently, many sutras begin with "thus have I heard." What does this mean? When Shakyamuni Buddha entered Nirvana, he said that to ensure future generations would have faith. This phrase could be added at the beginning and a description of the setting added at the end. This is authorized language. In this context, what does "thus" signify? It represents the perfection of the Dharma. It implies the perfection of Wisdom Sutra. All of the Dharma is contained within this "thus." Why say "thus"? It means that when Shakyamuni Buddha was present, he spoke the heart of the perfection of Wisdom Sutra. As for the content of the Heart Sutra, I heard it exactly as it was, truthfully and authentically. Nothing was added or removed. No additions, no deletions. It is entirely the Buddha's word. So "thus" carries this weight. It means, this is how I heard it at that time. And what does that entail? Whatever the Buddha said, I heard. Starting from the 5 aggregates are all empty, all the way to gate paragate. Everything in between was spoken by the Buddha at that time. Thus, this excludes the speech of others. These are not someone else's words. They are the Buddha's. Moreover, it is the complete and perfect word of the Buddha. Moving on to the next 2 words, I heard. To whom does I refer? It should be the Bodhisattva Vajrapani. As many of you know, at Vulture Peak Mountain, after the Buddha turned the second wheel of Dharma, Manjushri, Maitreya and others, 100,000 bodhisattvas compiled the teachings. The Prajnaparamita Sutras were mainly compiled by Vajrapani. So these are the words of Vajrapani. It's like a meeting report. This is what I heard at the time, followed by the signature of the Secretary General at the end. In "thus have I heard," the I refers to Bodhisattva Vajrapani. I heard has 2 layers of meaning. Some commentators explain the phrase I heard this way. Sometimes when I'm teaching here, someone nearby might be dozing off or fidgeting in their seat. If I get distracted by watching them, I might forget the Dharma content I was just explaining and lose my train of thought. I see some people reading other books down there or even using their prayer beads for divination. They aren't listening to the Heart Sutra at all. They are checking if they'll strike it rich. When I see that, I sometimes wonder myself, who is the I in "thus have I heard"? The content of what was heard is already forgotten. Then there are those with dirty fingernails using their right nail to pick at the left. For them, "thus have I heard" might be a challenge. They might not hear it as it is, but only roughly hear it. Some masters say the word "heard" here implies, I could only hear it, but I did not fully grasp it. This highlights how profound the Buddha's teaching on emptiness is. So Vajrapani says very humbly, I simply heard these words exactly as they were spoken, leaving nothing out, yet I have not fully realized the meaning. That is one interpretation. However, the great Taranatha of the Jonang school argued that this explanation is unreasonable. Hearing the words doesn't mean the meaning was entirely missed. Much of the meaning was understood. We shouldn't deny everything based on a single word. The significance was indeed grasped. In the future, whatever sutra you study, you will see "thus have I heard" at the start. You might notice that some teachers today love giving lectures on various sutras, this sutra and that sutra, but when it comes to explaining "thus have I heard," their explanations can sometimes be quite comical. Without naming names, the I in "thus have I heard" is not the self, nor is it Shakyamuni Buddha. nor does it refer to Ananda or Maudgalyana at that time. It always refers to the compiler. The compiler is saying, "This is how I heard it then." Just like the meeting minutes I mentioned, the chairperson wouldn't be the one saying, "It's like this." This point should be clear to everyone. As for the meaning of "thus have I heard," some say "I heard" refers to the perfection of faith, which is also included here. These are two types of perfection. One is the Dharma, and the other is faith. In Mahayana treatises, "I heard" implies hearing directly and exactly as it was spoken. In the Shravakayana, it's not necessarily all heard directly. When Ananda compiled the teachings, he stated as much. Out of the 84,000 Dharma gates, 64,000 gates were heard by him personally in the presence of the Buddha, while 20,000 doors were heard from others. So indirect hearing is also included in "I heard," but from the Mahayana perspective, content received directly is what is meant by "thus have I heard." That is the meaning of the phrase. Next, "at one time" means on a certain occasion. On one occasion, this is what I heard. Why isn't it more specific? Because the Buddha's manifestations are infinite. For some beings he taught in the summer, for others he taught in the winter. This is why there are so many different historical accounts of the Buddha's parinirvana. The reason lies right here. Therefore there is no single exact date. If we were ordinary people, we might say, "On this month and day, at 3:30 p.m., I spoke in such and such a hall." Stating a precise time like that is fine for us. But in a broader sense, "at one time" means on an occasion when the causes and conditions had ripened. Some historians believe that before the longer Prajnaparamita Sutras were taught, the Buddha had already turned the wheel of the Heart Sutra. At one time indicates there is no fixed date, precisely because the Buddha's manifestations take many forms. This represents the fulfillment of time. Next is Bhagavan. In Sanskrit it is often found in phrases like Bhagavan Sarva Tathagata. Bhagavan is translated into Chinese as Chu Yu Huai. Generally we say Tathagata, Arhat, Samyak Sambuddha, Bhagavan. What does Chu mean? It means having transcended the extremes of samsara and nirvana. Yu possessing refers to having the merits of the 6 paramitas. Huai destroying means having destroyed the 4 maras. The Buddha alone possesses these qualities. In some texts he is called the world-honored one, in others the Bhagavan. The term Bhagavan appears frequently in the sutras. Only a Buddha fully embodies these attributes. This refers to Shakyamuni Buddha, representing the perfection of the teacher. At one time, Shakyamuni Buddha was staying at Vulture Peak Mountain in Rajya. You are likely familiar with Rajya. It was the capital of the kingdom of Magadha. It's about 10 kilometers or so from Rajya to Nalanda. Rajya and Vulture Peak are actually very close. Shakyamuni Buddha spent a considerable amount of time there. During the Buddha's lifetime, great figures like Ananda, Kashyapa, and Maudgalyana all took refuge in the Buddha there. Historically, it is a very famous Buddhist site. Regarding Vulture Peak, some scholars believe the name comes from a large rock on the mountain that resembles a vulture. Indeed, in certain photographs you can see a massive stone shaped like a vulture's body. That is one reason why it's called Vulture Peak. Some believe it's called Vulture Peak because many vultures lived there, so it was named Vulture Peak. In any case, the Buddha was staying there at the time. As mentioned in last year's lectures on the 3 vows, Vulture Peak was where Shakyamuni Buddha turned the second wheel of Dharma. To ordinary people, the Buddha taught the Nirvana Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, and many other scriptures while staying at Vulture Peak. But to the extraordinary bodhisattvas, as the Golden Light Sutra explains, Vulture Peak is actually the Dharma Dhatu, the unique sphere of the Buddha's activity. Vulture represents the luminous nature of reality. It is exclusively the domain of the Buddha's realization. So the name Vulture Peak Mountain is a title for the wisdom of the Dharma Dhatu. The famous master Lotsawa, the Tibetan translator, once went to Vulture Peak. He saw the entire mountain as the Prajnaparamita Sutra and was too awestruck to ascend. When His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche visited that place, he said Lotsawa didn't dare to go up back then, but we should go up and have a look today. As we climbed, we saw the teaching throne of Shakyamuni Buddha, the place where he turned the wheel of Dharma. There were the caves of Ananda, Maudgalyana, Kashyapa, and many others. At the summit there is also the World Peace Pagoda. His Holiness visited India in 1990. At that time it was almost impossible to find a Chinese speaker. India hadn't really opened up yet, and among Tibetans very few could travel there directly with a passport. But I recently watched a video showing that many people from all over China and the world are now visiting those holy sites. Personally, I have no desire to go. Being there would only fill my heart with sorrow. Visiting places where His Holiness once stayed now makes me feel deeply saddened. During my recent trips to Hangzhou, Shanghai and Beijing, I was constantly thinking to myself, Master was here before. I'd remember where he taught and what he said, but now Master has passed away. Thinking of this makes me not want to go out at all. When His Holiness visited France, Sogyal Rinpoche shared a story. He had once taught in a church in America alongside Dujom Rinpoche. Later, when he returned to teach there alone, he felt very sad. That was his experience. At the time, I didn't quite understand. I thought it shouldn't be a problem. When the Master is gone, you carry on the teaching. There's no need to be so heartbroken just because you're in that church. But later I realized that these feelings are actually quite powerful. Living here at the Academy, we sometimes don't feel it as much. It's only when we return from a trip that the feeling becomes overwhelming. Otherwise, it isn't always so obvious. Personally, if I were to go to India now, visiting the places my teachers went would be even more painful. Thinking of the places where my Master made aspirations, or remembering his moments of joy, would probably not be a very happy experience for me. I've heard among our fellow practitioners that some of you really want to go to India. Of course, how many of you go doesn't really matter to me personally. But if I had to choose between listening to teachings and going to India, well, if your studies are complete and you have graduated, then going to India is perfectly fine. But truthfully, when weighing the two, I believe hearing the Dharma is more important. You might not have the chance to hear these teachings later. No matter how you look at it, such opportunities will only become rarer. I believe that if you are a practitioner who follows the path correctly, you will surely have enough money. And with money, since the world is becoming more and more open, increasingly accessible, going to India in the future will be as easy as going to Sertar County. I hear you whispering among yourselves, hey, did you hear so-and-so went to India? Should we go too? Let's sell the house. Let's calculate the costs, even the furnace money, from here to there. Constantly planning and calculating every day. Is it really necessary? Of course, if you all go to India, it would actually mean less pressure for me. I'd be happy, it's fine. It's okay if everyone goes to India. However, whether you will ever have this specific chance to hear the Dharma again is hard to say. Please give it some careful thought. Since we just mentioned Vulture Peak, perhaps I can elaborate a bit more today. The other day, an elderly Khenpo in our monastery began his lecture at around 2 in the afternoon and was sometimes still going at past 5. He just kept teaching and teaching. I'll follow his example today. We could probably finish class around 11:30. Together with a great community of bhiksus and bodhisattvas, mahasattvas. Some commentators believe that these great bhiksus were not ordinary monks, but great bhiksus who had attained the state of arhat, the ultimate bhiksus among the 5 types. And the great bodhisattvas refers to those who have reached the bhumis, other ordinary bodhisattvas, those who have only generated the mundane bodhicitta, or bhiksus, who have only taken the common monastic vows, were not the primary intended audience. They could be called auditors. They weren't officially enrolled in Shakyamuni Buddha's class back then. The word together means they were all gathered in full presence. Why do we emphasize this gathering? Some masters explain it this way. Such a gathering serves a specific purpose. For example, in the presence of the Buddha, there were so many bodhisattvas and bhiksus. In some Chinese translations it says 77,000 bodhisattvas were gathered. However, it's unclear if this number appears in the Sanskrit. As we were just saying, some versions of the Heart Sutra state that 77,000 bodhisattvas were present. Regardless of how many were gathered, the ultimate purpose was to benefit all beings, to attain Buddhahood, and to behold the Buddha. There were several goals in mind. Similarly, for our friends who are here today, why have we gathered together? The goal is to eliminate our own afflictions and attain some level of realization. Once realization is attained, it's not for one's own pleasure, nor for worldly blessings. It doesn't work that way. One should strive to benefit sentient beings. The gathering of the Buddha and his disciples is similar to the gatherings today, wherever they may be. Every Buddhist group practicing the Dharma shares a common objective. We should all be clear about this. The point I was making is that within the phrase, "Thus have I heard," There are the perfections of the teaching and the compiler, the perfect time, and the Buddha refers to the perfect teacher. Vulture Peak in Raja is the perfect place. These are the 5 perfections. Adding the bhikshus and bodhisattvas makes the perfect retinue. Some masters speak of 7 perfections by dividing the retinue into 2, the special retinue and the common retinue. Great bodhisattvas are the Buddha's direct audience, as prajna paramita is taught directly to them. Arhats are considered the common retinue. In this way, there are 7 perfections in total: teaching, compiler, teacher, place, common retinue, special retinue, and the excellence of time. These make up the 7. It's also fine to refer to them simply as the 5 perfections, counting the retinue as 1 and excluding the compiler. When explaining the tantric teachings, we also speak of the 5 perfections. In his commentary, Vairotsana didn't use the Sutrayana method. Instead, much like in the Great Net of Illusion, he spoke of the outer, inner, and secret retinue, as well as the outer, inner, and secret teacher. All 5 excellences are explained through the lens of outer, inner, and secret. That's how they are interpreted. Actually, among past masters, some have explained the Heart Sutra according to the view of Dushaokchen, while others use the Mahamudra approach. Such methods of interpretation are quite common in Tibetan Buddhism. However, for this series I will at most use the Great Middle Way approach. I think if we can explain it through the Great Middle Way, that would already be excellent. When I taught the Heart Sutra in Kunming, most of the audience had never heard of the Middle Way. I could tell by their expressions that something was wrong. Then I thought to myself, how happy I am teaching the Middle Way at the Academy. Everyone there is so engaged, but here they even struggle with such a basic level of emptiness. They just couldn't wrap their heads around it. If I were to teach the root stanzas of the Middle Way, they would probably all be asleep. Sometimes while teaching, I feel quite pained inside. I have that kind of feeling, but I had to carry on, so I just continued at a superficial level. So I think our environment here is completely different from those settings. You are all very focused and energized. We'll stop here for today.
Bandara Badma Sadar